afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast State of the Balance with me, your host Imperial Dane, a master of everything. And my co-host, the Jumping Kitten, Basil, who's now kind of running about somewhere. Anyway, so what's happened to us really since last week? I mean, in many ways, not really a lot. We're still waiting for some sort of balance patch, at least the Commander revamps. So in that sense, there's not really been any sort of change of factors as such. And for the most part, nothing's really like hugely changed within the meta. So there has still been noticeable changes. Also, I think we're mostly going through that. I mean, with the Americans, I mean, it's sort of largely the same. They'll likely, trying to stall into some sort of armor mechanized doctrine that's coming on more and more, as it can be a very good shock doctrine. In a sense, like the opponent isn't prepared for it, can quickly run them, so just, pull into some tanks and quickly finish off. And in many sense, like, if we were to compare to some sort of, other game, like, say, a card game, it'd be more sort of, an aggro deck. Essentially, like, you just try and hit the field as hard as possible, or when your opponent for things to stabilize, and then you crush them with a tank. So, in many ways, mechanized to an extent sort of, follows a strategy, and you can't deal with it, the doctrine tends to run out of steam pretty hard. So that's what I think the sort of major change. The logic still got plenty of people just stalling into Pershings. That's very much meta. Shermans, Jacksons, all that. I mean, in many ways, the Americans still were the same faction. They just try to snowball very hard due to the fact that, again, they have these, very strong tech abilities since they get free units when they tech. And again, they to an extent still feel like, compared to all the early snowballing facilitating they are a bit too strong in late game. So in some ways, like, at least they can just snowball it too hard without the opponent really having a good chance coming back if they make any small mistakes. So pardon me, still would like to see either the early game being loosened up a bit, or the late game at least taking a hit somewhere, because in particular with the Jacksons, they tend to run around them with tanks, which they're not supposed to. So maybe a small note for the Jackson durability again could be in the right place, but beyond that, not much more to say. So it's remained very strong as well, capable of executing various strategies very well. You can dominate the early game and the late game. I mean, they pack a lot of stuff. Their T-35 spam is very common. Guard spam is also very common. I mean, basically lots of spam from the Soviets, and not necessarily always the best way to sort of show us, hey, punishing it in any way. I mean, they sort of had to send some very good overlapping in a lot of ways. So it's a bit hard to say specifically what. I mean, in many ways, again, you can sort of expect a lot of things from the Soviets. Yeah, cat tipped over something. He is a bit hyperactive now, as you might have noticed. The dumb cat. But, basically, so the common strategies are the penal builds into sort of like guardsmen, conjugate builds into a lot of guardsmen, and then usually some sort of tank being spammed. Commonly, again, is the T-35. Some might go for the T-34 section. You actually threaten them with tanks. They may go for S-35s, try and counter that. So there are some strategies, but that's to an extent very much narrowed down. And while they seem to be trying to buff shock troopers to make them more viable, I can't help but feel like they're going about this the wrong way, because I don't think the issue is the shock troopers are bad. It's just guardsmen are really good. Like, they are just so very strong that just, I don't know, if you want to make the shock troopers good enough to compete with them, you're going to have to make the shock troopers kind of nuts. So I'm not 100% sure that's going to work out perfectly with the Commander revamp mod, to put it mildly. I mean, again, I do feel like the guardsmen need some sort of nerf. They are probably a bit too strong in some ways. In particular, spammed. I mean, one guard squad, fair enough, but most players will go for 2 or 3, outgrowing with DP light machine guns, at which point things get a lot trickier. So there might be some problems on the horizons there, depending on what they do. And a part of me also feels like they need to look into the surge support weapons. I mean, just spamming them is quite easy. In particular, I feel like the field guns are very much overperforming. I mean, they're basically, for most parts, pack 40s, except harder, can spot for themselves with the doctrine of veterancy abilities, and they can double as artillery. I mean, sure, they don't have the exact same stats, but the stats are pretty close. So I do feel like they need to look at making the support weapons, at least in the field gun, perhaps a bit weaker in some way. I mean, again, it feels like the third package have been rather overtuned. So again, maybe just nerfing the field gun a bit could be quite an idea. Then again, a part of me just feels like all anti-tank guns need a nerf. I feel like they overall overperform versus most targets. Like, they're good versus light, mediums, and heavy, and I kind of feel like there needs to be more distinctions there. Like, they need to be not super amazing against everything. In that regard, I'd probably just look to making heavier armor better by nerfing all anti-tank guns just a bit there. I mean, give them some deflection damage to make up for it, but still, they shouldn't just be easily to penetrate, like, say, a Tiger and IS-2 or Pershing or whatever. So that will sort of, be my thoughts there a bit. And finally, the British sort of always in that slightly weird spot where they can do one thing really, really well, but they tend to struggle with in sort of more flexible play due to lacking the tools for such flexible play, which is kind of one of the issues. When Relic decides, they want to make a new faction, rather than just looking, well, how do these units interact with each other, they look, alright, we add one really big drawback, and then we make the infantry really, really good to compensate. Which is sort of, the wrong way to go about it. It didn't work with the Brits in companies 1, and it certainly didn't work with the Brits in companies 2. I mean, they're still lacking a lot of tools, but again, to compensate, the infantry is really, really good and really, really annoying if they just decide to blob it up. And they're sort of, kind of pushing that further a bit as well there with the patch, when they're now giving the sappers anti-tank grenades plus anti-tank mines. I feel like they're just further strengthening the blobs. And I'm a bit concerned about that. I still feel like they need to nerf the infantry sections. Like, make them worse out of cover, because right now they're way too good. Like, nerf them in some way, just make them worse in cover. But right now I feel like they just push the infantry sections too far, and they've yet to, actually fix that. Beyond that, I mean, British strategy and can sort of go in slightly different directions. Most commonly still though is mobile assault, because it's pretty good, and because the land matches is still, despite being nerfed repeatedly, still kinda nuts. So I mean, that tends to be very common. Some go for Vanguard, some go for Commandos. For advanced emplacement doctrine has become very popular alongside mobile mortar spam strategies. Essentially, like where some players will just spam several down with a forward assembly, and certainly highlights that the whole emplacement business is still kinda wonk. And honestly, they probably just need to nerf the brace or something else when it comes to the emplacement, because it really shouldn't just be, just place them down in a really nasty spot on a small map and just, grind down your opponent. It's not really fun for the opponent. It doesn't give them a lot of options. It's kind of dumb. So really, I feel like they just also need to hit the emplacements in terms of bracing, because that one's just still a really dumb idea. I mean, basic rendering something really almost unkillable, and then of course allowing the opponent to that placement in really bad spots while still being covered by a really potent blob. So again, it kind of feels like they learned nothing there from Companies 1, when they really should have learned that one of the primary lessons is blobs with emplacements is a really god-awful idea. Specifically, bulletproof infantry that allows blobs with emplacements are a bad idea. It's just god-awful to play against. But again, they have this idea where, again, to differentiate factions, rather than say, again, we have a faction with like this bonuses for the infantry cooperates with armor or with support weapons or anything else that gets aside. Well, they don't have mortars that are mobile, that is, but on the other hand, the infantry is bulletproof. I mean, in some way, that's basically always what they end up doing. Like the Panzer Elite back then, alright, well, they don't have any usual support weapons, but on the other hand, their infantry is really good. The infantry back then, they don't even have machine guns. Well, the infantry is really, really good. And here, they don't have mortars. The infantry is really good. And the American initially also disarmed without that, so again, the infantry was really good. Now, of course, they got a lot of the stuff to compensate, but the infantry is still really, really good. So I really feel like in this regard, there's a bit of a design flaw with Relic, where again, they just apparently cannot harness the concept of synergies and interactions, and rather just focus on giving some sort of weakness and then making the infantry really, really good, because that's literally always the thing they do. Same over the Oberkommand list, Volksgunners and Sturmpanies initially were nuts to compensate again for all the stuff they were lacking. It's like, this repeating pattern. So if there's ever Companies 3, I certainly hope they have finally learned their lesson about this. Like, stop trying to make a faction unique by taking away stuff and then making the infantry really, really good. It doesn't work. Moving on to the Germans, the Oberkommand is still very much the Volksgrenadier spam strategy to an extent, because that's what works. You can go for more Sturmpani heavy strategies, but they're more risky, and still it can easily get punished, because the Sturmpani compared to still more vulnerable to the Volksgrenadiers. In some ways, they actually don't do a lot more damage to the longer terms. So in that sense, Volksgrenadiers with assault rifles just perform better. In that regard, they probably need to nerf the Volksgrenadiers a bit, and still I think need to in some way make the Sturmpaniers just a tad better long term, like give them some sort of upgrade that unlocks for, say, certain amounts of buildings that gives them infrared assault rifles, something there just so they stand out just a teensy bit more, and so Volksgrenadier spam isn't necessarily the de facto strategy. Otherwise, it's a split between Battlegroup headquarters and flak half-tracks from light infantry guns, and Luxus with mechanized regiments. Some go for Stukas of Fuses in team games, and then usually into a lot of Panzer IVs, though some will go for Panthers if the situation demands it, and some go straight for it because Panthers are kind of good. Beyond that, there are not much else to sort of report on the Oberkommand West. Doctrinal choices are largely spare cuts for the Command Panther, they're slightly behind. Otherwise, you know, Luftwaffe is a common choice as well that appears very commonly. And some go for Fallsturm and a few other doctrines. Breakthrough sees occasional use in there, but nothing massive. Finally, with the Wehrmacht, there is some variety in strategies, but overall, since the openings are very much the same. Grenadiers, machine guns, maybe a mortar, maybe a sniper. Take it into tier 2 usually, go for a pack forward, and then move straight into tier 3 because you kind of need the Panzer IV in many situations to pull through. But there has been an increase in players, you know, branching out in other strategies. Sturmpanzer rushes, for example, becoming very common, usually followed up by a Panther and then sort of take on the armor. But the Sturmpanzer is proving itself to be quite the game winner. Can obviously punish blobs quite hard, deal with infantry spam, and otherwise support weapon spam. So in many regards, the Sturmpanzer IV is winning, you know, good progress into a lot of German players' strategies, in that way making impact on the metas. That's certainly something that's standing out. Panzer Grenadiers are certainly happening here and there, and doctrinally most of it is still Lightning War and the likes, though there are some increasingly actually going for elite troops again. Jaeger infantry happens, of course, also from time to time, but I'd say it's elite troops one that sort of stands out the most there, even with Tiger Race happening. So there are some, you know, happenings there with the Wehrmacht doctrine. It's certainly showing signs of increased flexibility. We'll of course see what the Commander Revamp mod further does for that. So I mean, it's not too shabby for the Wehrmacht. Still, part of me feels like the Wehrmacht late game is still awkward and does lack some punch, but it's definitely not as bad as it used to be. So I think that sort of covers the state of the balance here for September 2018. It's going to be interesting to see what happens once the Commander Revamp mod hits, though there's obviously a bit more before that one hits. But for now, it's certainly looking interesting. There'll be a video about that with the latest update probably tomorrow. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts. If you did, subscribe, like, share, comment. This is Imperial signing off another time for another video. Cheers.